in my experience, the most important thing you can do in any given day is read out loud to your kids.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Chief Marketing Officer. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. So, Andrew, about 6 months or so ago, you had suggested to me, which when you get a suggestion from your boss, that kind of means you do it.
Well,
that we spend some time every 10 episodes or so talking about homeschooling basics, just because we've had more and more people consider the realities of homeschooling, some of them actually being forced to do it, albeit maybe temporarily, and thinking, wow, maybe this isn't as hard as I thought, or maybe this is something I'd like to continue doing, but how do I really get into it? So right when this first started happening, the whole COVID, the pandemic, the people being sent home from school, we actually started a Homeschooling Helps Facebook page that has been, helpful.
We hope so.
And we're not really just pushing the IEW curriculum. It's more of a community where people can help one another with their homeschooling Q&A.
I've been to several conventions this past month, and I have met a lot of people who started homeschooling middle of last year,
right,
and continued on through the end and are planning to continue on. So it's interesting times.
Right, exactly. I think when I think about my own homeschooling journey, I was not really one of the pioneers because I'm not that old.
No, neither of us are old enough to
Right.
qualify as pioneers.
Right, but it was during a time where homeschooling wasn't as accepted, and there were questions about whether or not my kids were going to be able to succeed in college. They did. Whether or not they're going to be able to find a lovely wife. I have boys, and they did. And whether or not they're able to raise children. They are. Well, at least one of them is because of grandchildren. So, I feel like I've checked the boxes. But I started when my kids were, kindergarten, first grade, and we went all the way through. But not everybody does that. And some of these new homeschoolers, they're jumping in with their kids in junior high and high school, and that can be a little bit overwhelming. But anyway, just talk about what your experience is with these conversations that you're having, and what kind of help are these new to homeschooling families needing?
Well, a lot of times if they're coming out of a school, there's a decompression period kind of has to happen. And that moment that they decide to make that switch may or may not be during, say, the holiday vacation or during the summer. And I guess the most common thing people say is, well, I want to be sure that my kids don't get behind, or maybe I think my kid or kids are behind and I want to do something about that. Or kind of along the same lines as, well, we started homeschooling, but I need to cover all the bases.
Cover all the bases, yep.
Which, when I hear that one, I think of a baseball field that has this very, very thin layer of water, just completely, a quarter-inch deep and a mile wide, and very unusable as a baseball field.
Yes.
Of course, that's not where the expression comes from. But there is that, I think, that feeling like, okay, now I have to figure out everything the school was doing and how to do everything.
Right.
Or if, we're starting homeschooling, first grade, whatever, we have to be sure that we do everything the school would be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of parents that have been, started in there in 3 or 4 years, they get free of that to some degree. It's like, okay, let's major in the majors and not worry about everything and think about what are the priorities right now. And for a lot of kids, that's just relationships. That's getting used to spending all day, every day with members of your family. It's used to being a little more independent in working because there's no one there to hold your hand and tell you what to do every minute of the whole school day. And those are all adjustments that have to happen.
Right. So let's just walk through a scenario, okay? It's March of 2020 and your kids came home and they were not given a whole lot of guidance. And you, whether through you or your spouse or somehow you figured out how to get them through the end of the school year. And now we're coming around year 2 and you're still kids at home. Okay, now it's summer of 2021, which is right where we are.
Right.
And you're thinking, all right, I want to continue doing this. What are the most important things that I want to be able to cover? And let's just say it's a middle school student.
Yeah, well, the idea of ending in March, or coming out of school, most of the people I met there had schools that were trying to do with greater and lesser levels of success, distance or remote learning or, helping the kids stay in the loop, so to speak. And then, summer hits and everybody shuts down for a while. Evaporation occurs.
Right. Did you see that one video? And we'll put a link in the show notes. I'm sure it's out there somewhere where this Zoom classroom was captured. And I think they were like second graders. And the teacher's camera went out. And the kids were like, what do we do? And one of the kids says, oh, we're toast. And another kid goes, oh, I want some toast. And they go make some. And then one of the students says, well, you shouldn't do that. You need to stay here. It's pretty cute,
Yeah, lots of stories. I heard about one case where a child was in a Zoom classroom and he was, I don't know, misbehaving in some way. And so he was assigned detention.
Okay.
In another Zoom classroom.
Oh, that's funny.
Where he had to basically just sit there and stare at the screen as a penalty for failing to stare at the screen conscientiously enough.
Wow. Yeah.
But it's hard. How do the teachers and schools keep the kids focused and all that? And I think some of that contributed to parents' willingness to consider. We could do this. We can look at this world of homeschooling. So, there's a lot of ways to approach it. The kind of simple traditional way would be to say, well, the 3 R's, right? Reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Right.
And that's got to be first.
Right.
We do a lot in the area of the reading and writing business because we have our arts of language, listening, speaking, reading, writing, and then the result, better thinking, we hope. But there is that idea of, okay, even if I'm willing to kind of strip it down to that and not worry about all the peripheral subjects, whatever they might be, health, social studies, PE, art, music, and not that those aren't all valuable, but if you have to say, okay, what do I do first, and then how do I do that? I try to help people understand that, in my experience, the most important thing you can do in any given day is read out loud to your kids. And you create community, make it a priority and do it first thing or at the time when everybody's available. And don't give it short shrift. Don't just, read a story for 15 minutes and call it done. Try to schedule, half an hour, 45 minutes, a whole hour of just reading good or great books, historical fiction, excerpts from history books that then create a shared experience in the family. And that's just, that's what kids love, is they love knowing stuff, and they love being with other people who know similar things, right? I mean, if you get together, it's like, oh, I knew that, and did you know this? And you just start sharing. So it's probably the best way to kind of integrate a family, to create that shared and valued experience, build the knowledge base, whether it's fiction classics or nonfiction. There's so much that can be discussed and gained from that.
Right.
Then I go ahead and point out that if what you want is a really good writer and speaker of English 15 years from now, what should you do? Read out loud to your kids.
Right, exactly.
As much as possible. That's a real shift for everybody because they haven't got that in schools.
Well, and I remember my 5th grade teacher, in particular Mrs. Jensen, did read us after recess. And we read through Where the Red Fern Grows, if I can say that. And I think it's hilarious that now I live
in eastern Oklahoma,
where
Red
it
Fern
all happened,
territory.
right?
Yeah.
But I remember that as a very special time. And it was only maybe 15 minutes a day, but we got through lots of books in that amount of time. So.
Well, and there are still teachers out there who can squeeze the time to do that. Yeah, but it's definitely harder.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a lot harder over a Zoom room.
Oh, right.
Just because, how do you keep the kids involved? And then maybe they are doing something with their hands to keep their, eyes busy so their ears work better.
Well,
but they look inattentive.
Yeah. Well, and talk about that, because just share that little scenario that you mentioned in your talk, Nurturing Competent Communicators, the idea of keeping your hands busy while you're listening.
You do notice that, some kids are just wanting to do something all the time. I'm sure I was kind of like that, a little on the hyperactive side, like, okay, I'm not doing anything. So, as you're reading to the family, the kids can play with Legos or blocks, draw pictures, crochet, something so that, they feel like they're doing something and their hands and eyes are occupied, and that actually frees up their ears to hear better. Not all kids. Some will look straight at your face and, kind of read your lips while you're talking, but a lot of them do better in that case. In fact, I've even had adults come to my workshops or an all-day seminar, and they'll pull out a bag and start knitting or something. And first couple times I thought, well, that's kind of awful, like they're bored with what I'm doing. But I started to realize, they know themselves. They know that they can listen better. I compare it to listening to audiobook. I think I actually listen better and remember more if I'm driving than if I were just sitting in a chair trying to concentrate.
Right. Right.
So, that would be the starting point for education at home would be kind of a good, great living books approach and integrating that in the day, during the best time of the day with all the kids. And you can read to a whole family. You don't have to read different stuff to different kids. You kind of, read from the top down and just let it trickle down. And, 5-year-olds don't understand everything anyway, so why worry about it?
Right. Well, and I know our listeners are thinking this question that I'm going to answer for you right now, dear listener. What books should I read? And we have 2 resources for you that we'll mention. One is we have a reading list on our website. So we'll put a link in the show notes. This is just a free download. It has many resources, including some of the books that Adam Andrew recommends in his Teaching the Classics book, Resource Curriculum for Teachers. And then just a link to our dear friend Sarah McKenzie and her Read Aloud Revival. She's got a tool on her website where you can pick what genre you want to read, what age group you're wanting to hit, and how long you want the book to be, and she'll give you 3 suggestions, and you can do it over and over again, and it's really fun.
We also have Gail Ledbetter's timeline of classics.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's a great resource.
And it's got probably 2,000 books in it. I mean, it's huge.
So what period of history you're studying, perhaps ancient, medieval,
Yeah, it's
modern
organized so the books are either written in or about that time period, and then there's very brief description along with the author, and then the reading level, elementary, middle, and high school.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I talked to her once about how she got the idea of doing it, and she said, well, there's so many moms, they didn't grow up, reading as much as I did, or, people my age, and they'd go to the library and not be sure, what should I get? And so she kind of started compiling this book list of, here's what you can go and find in the library and bring home and know that it's good. It's got it stood the test of time. It has the tradition. It has the value. Otherwise, more and more you can be confused by what you find in libraries because you don't recognize it. You're not sure what it is. You can't read every book. It's hard to know. So, we have those resources.
Great.
Another thing that I have talked a lot, and we have had podcasts, and I think we've enjoyed the feedback from these talks and podcasts, and that's just about getting outside.
Yes.
And, more time in nature, and there's so many, physical, mental, psychological, spiritual advantages. And sometimes it seems, I think, to new homeschoolers like, okay, if we're homeschooling, we have to stay, doing school, from 8:30 to 3:30 every day, or else we won't be doing enough.
Right.
And so to kind of give yourself permission to just say, no, we could just stop everything at 11 o'clock and go have a picnic and hike this afternoon. And you won't lose anything. It's not like you're going to get behind in academics. And if anything, the rejuvenation that occurs by just getting outside on a nice day is going to make the next day's learning and the next week's learning even better. So I'm encouraging people to say, okay, you're out of school. You don't have to do it like that. You don't have to follow that schedule. You don't have to get the, different book with a number on the cover for every single kid and get through them by the end of the year. There's so many options that are different and possibly better.
I saw an ad from our friends at VRBO. They're not really our friends, but, vacation rentals.
Oh, yeah.
And they were talking about, now that you have this opportunity to essentially homeschool your kids, how about taking them out to nature? And there's a little girl building a little collage with pine needles and presenting this. And I thought, how great. That's like exactly what you can do now that you've got kids at home. Did your wife ever do this? Did you ever do this where, 11 o'clock, you pack up things, you just need to change a pace, and you pack them all up in the car, bring the books and a picnic lunch, and you do school at the park?
Sure.
And then you're at the picnic table and you're doing the math and the writing and then maybe reading a book and then the lure of the swings and the jungle gym and all right, let's just finish one more chapter and then you can go play.
Yeah.
And then they're motivated to get it done because they see that. We got to do that a lot more in Southern California than we could possibly do that in Oklahoma.
Well, and I was going to say both of us spent many, many years homeschooling in California, where we have a slight weather advantage over many places.
Yes.
But, that would encourage people who live in places that tend to be very, very hot or very, very cold, and it's harder to make the most of the days where it is good. And, that's something that's tough for a teacher in a school to say, let's just suspend everything this afternoon and spend the time outside. Yeah. But we can in the homeschool.
Instead of a snow day, call it a Sunday and get out there.
A month of Sundays. We always have that expression. So, that would be the second thing, to kind of just decompress from the school. And the other thing that I get a lot of is people thinking, okay, my child was in nth grade.
Right.
So now I have to get the next nth grade
Right.
and do all that. And then they'll qualify that and say, except, she reads really well, or except, he seems like he's behind. And so the third thing that I would really encourage parents to do is just kind of let it go, at least for a while, this idea of comparing children based on age, and just compare them with each other, with themselves. So
Right, not siblings necessarily.
compare them with themselves. So in math, it doesn't really matter where every other 10-year-old in the world is in terms of math skill. What matters is your 10-year-old improved over the last 6 months or a year. And, then that rate of improvement is something you can attend to. But that's probably the next most freeing idea that new homeschooling parents can adopt, which is don't stress about grade level. It's funny. People don't mind, oh, my child's ahead. Nobody said, oh, no, I'm so worried my child is ahead of other children.
Right.
But they will be worried and thinking, oh, no, his reading is behind, or, he is challenged in math, or, she hates writing. We can help with some of that. But the main thing is just stop the comparison and say, okay, so this is what we can do. What's the next step? And then, trying to find materials that don't necessarily have numbers on the cover.
Right.
We've been very intentional about having no numbers. And even when we are forced to put numbers in descriptions, we make it intentionally vague. Grade 3 to 5, grade 6 to 8. Well, what about my kid who's 13? Okay, doesn't matter.
Right.
You can go this way or that way. And it's always better to err on the side of being a little simpler, a little easier, get done a little sooner, so that the child has that experience of, oh, I can do that.
Right.
Right. Than something that is just overwhelming to the point of frustration, and then there's, I hate this, and there's tears, and I never want to do it again. So sometimes it's just that reawakening, that the feeling of success that then helps with the motivation and leads to the willingness to re-engage academically.
Right. Yep. Good. I think that one of the things that was important to us when we were on this homeschooling journey is just kind of what I've heard you say, just do the next best thing. And for us, that meant, okay, are we going to be doing this another year? Because it might just be that this is the last year that we're going to homeschool. And if so, what are the most important things that we want to accomplish this year? Maybe this is the year to really focus on drilling those math facts. This might be the year to really get through some of those classic books that, well, maybe I never read growing up, but maybe I want to have my children read. I did that with my son. I told him, I've never read Moby Dick, but I think you should. And to this day, he scolds me for forcing him to read Moby Dick because it's basically chapters and chapters and pages about whale anatomy. Had no idea, but everybody should have read Moby Dick, apparently. So now I vicariously have read it through him.
Well, it's one of those things. Martin, my friend Martin, said to me once, you don't have to know Latin to be a gentleman. You just have to have learned enough to have forgotten some.
Oh, there you go.
But it's kind of that same idea, There are those things that we say, okay, we did that.
Yeah.
But more importantly, I think we're looking to create we always get these buzzwords, lifelong learner. It's a cliche. It's a buzzword. It's kind of ugly because of that. But what we do want is we want our kids to, as they get older and older, still have that spark of excitement about learning.
Yes.
On their own, if need be. And so thinking of ways to nurture and cultivate that as best as possible,
Yep.
That's very, very important in my view. The other thing that I think a lot of parents are increasingly sensitive to the importance of is history.
Oh, right.
And,
yeah.
History went off the report cards a long, long time ago and got replaced with social studies.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas before there was history and there was geography.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there are some things that may be contained in kind of standard social studies textbooks that are useful or help kids think about life. But the idea of let's actually learn the history of a country or the history of a people or the history of our own nation or the geography of the world we live in. So often today we hear, well, you don't need to know names and dates.
Right.
You don't need to know the capitals of states. I mean, you can just Google that up. You can just ask your phone. There's this idea that knowing things is not important so much anymore. It's more important to know how to use technology to do that. But that really isn't quite true.
Right.
Because there's two things to consider. One, there's a great joy in knowing stuff. This is illustrated by TV game shows.
Oh, right.
Why do people watch TV game shows that ask trivia questions?
Right.
Well, there's two things that can happen. One is you can say, I know that.
Right.
And you get super excited, like you knew the answer to that question. There's this incredible joy in having knowledge.
Right.
The other thing that can happen is you learn it. You say, well, that's really interesting. And you may or may not remember it, but that first repetition of that new fact kind of tickles you. Like, oh, that's interesting. I'm happy to now know that a little bit. So let's not discredit the delight that comes with just knowing stuff. And I do kind of mourn the fact that more and more people in kind of the broader progressive education world are buying into this idea that, Google and calculators and Alexa and your phone are the source of what you need, and you don't have to carry it around in your brain.
Right.
The other way to look at it is kind of a deconstruction. If you don't know this and you don't know that and you know less and less and less, pretty soon you can't really even ask the question because you don't know it exists.
Right.
So you could ask the question, what is the capital of Wyoming? And if you didn't know, your phone could tell you.
Right. Absolutely.
But what if you don't even know there's Wyoming?
Right.
I mean, honestly.
Right.
And you could extrapolate that to countries. You could put it out in history. And when you know names and dates and you know places, your magnificent brain puts all that stuff together and gives you insights that, Google or Alexa or Siri can never do for you.
Right.
So, I think a lot of parents, they've got a closer look at kind of the curriculum of schools, some of which they say, well, that's good. I'm glad they were doing that. Let's continue.
Right.
Usually it's the basic skills part. And then they may look and say, you know what? I think we could do better by taking maybe a little bit more traditional approach. And, of course, we could go on and on about memory and memory development and particularly how memorizing language, specifically poetry and then other things like scripture, famous speeches, whatever you're inclined, it's everything wrapped in. It's delight, it's knowing, it's sharing that delight, and then it's building the vocabulary and the syntax and the use of language database, even with the poetic devices that bring language to life even more. So I think a lot of parents have found themselves at homeschool conventions or online looking for, okay, so what's a good way to do something like geography or history or, memorize language or grammar.
Right.
Things that weren't happening in the school environment.
Right.
Not that there weren't teachers who might not have thought it was good. It's just they were busy with other things that maybe weren't as delightful.
Right. Exactly. Well, our timekeeper, of course, has told us minutes ago that we are out of time, but I know that you and I could continue to talk about this for another 30 minutes or so.
Sure. Well, we're doing it periodically, this
Yes.
kind of homeschool helps idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this just compels me to ask you, our listeners, do you have some specific questions for the homeschool parent emeritus that sit in this room, Andrew and Julie, who have homeschooled at various stages? I think this idea of just doing the next best thing and, studying history. We love to do timelines with history just to kind of visually put things in the map. But, I know that, let me just tell you right now, we're not going to make specific curricular recommendations other than use IEW, by structure and style for students, and linguistic development through poetry memorization, because we have a lot of friends.
But yeah, and there are a lot
doing
of
math and
Facebook
history,
groups and online forums where people say,
Yeah.
I have a dyslexic 13-year-old who doesn't like math.
Yeah.
What do you recommend?
What
there's
specifically do you
lots and
recommend?
lots of other people who are in that category
Right.
that are happy to make a recommendation.
Exactly. But do you have any questions for us listeners that we could answer? Or I know that we do an Ask Andrew Anything every 10 episodes, and so we'll save those questions, the specific questions for homeschooling, for these types of podcasts where how do I get started homeschooling? What are the benefits? What are the dangers? What are some things that, Andrew, maybe you and I experienced some pitfalls in homeschooling that we would like to recommend our dear friends to avoid, if at all possible. And we'll just continue to have these conversations until people decide that maybe homeschooling is right or not right for them. And yet I just wanted to also just end with this, is that IEW in general is not just for homeschoolers. We've talked about that before. We'll put a link to that 4-minute video where you just talk about kind of the big picture of what are we really doing here. And you say that it's not just for homeschoolers. It's not just for classroom teachers. We're the writing program for everyone. And so not to put aside our teachers in our classroom, because we love them and we know that partnering with parents is probably one of the best things that you can do. And so how can we continue to help you on this journey? Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, you can subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcast. Until then, on behalf of Andrew Pudawa and the team at IEW, I thank you for allowing us to partner with you on your journey toward better listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking.